war-torn skies of Europe with Hitler's mighty Luftwaffe. The Junkers Ju-52, known as Iron Annie, she blazed commercial aviation routes to the four corners of the earth. Bearing cargoes both benign and lethal, she was a vital tool of Nazi aggression. In the carnage and catastrophe at Stalingrad, she was the last hope of a doomed army. Tonight, fly the skies over embattled Europe on wings of the Luftwaffe.
This awkward-looking aircraft was born into an era of turmoil. It ranks as one of the most significant aircraft in aviation history. Simple, rugged, and dependable, it was a mainstay of Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe. The Junkers Ju-52 served doggedly until the bitter end of World War II. It still flies today. In 1990, Lufthansa Airlines' beautifully restored Ju-52 embarked on a publicity tour of the USA. The journey took 10 months and 200 flying hours and covered a distance of 40,000 kilometers, equivalent to a trip round the equator. The plane visited some 67 American airports and along the way transported 5,000 lucky passengers back in time. The Lufthansa aircraft, christened Tempelhof after the airline's home airport in Berlin, was acquired in 1984 from the noted American aviation author Martin Kadin. Now it's completely rebuilt and serves as a flying museum, giving modern-day enthusiasts a taste of civil aviation 1930s style. Zentralflughafen Tempelhof was a typical state-of-the-art airport in pre-war Germany. It was equipped with every amenity and located less than 2 miles from Germany's capital. With its geographical location in the center of Greater Europe, it was the vital hub of many continental air routes. By the late 1930s, Germany's burgeoning airline had the largest domestic network on the continent and operated a huge fleet of Ju-52s from Tempelhof. But Lufthansa's origins were modest, dating back to a 1926 government-backed merger that left the newly created company with a small number of Junkers' new all-metal monoplanes, the F-13. This innovative machine proved a safe and reliable means of transportation, laying the groundwork for the family of aircraft that eventually led to the Ju-52. As time passed, air travel was transformed from a high-risk adventure to a speedy and safe way of reaching far-flung destinations. And Lufthansa grew into a giant airline. Key to the successful development of safe airliners was the arrival of reliable engines, like the BMW Radial. With efficient dependability at a reasonable cost, Radials were considerably less difficult to maintain and operate than their liquid-cooled counterparts. They were free of temperamental plumbing and bulky radiators, and they soon became the engine of choice. The Radial was safer and cheaper to build, and less temperamental in extremely hot or cold climates. Regardless of their efficiency, Radials needed fuel, and lots of it. The Ju-52's cantilever wings and built-in fuel tanks carried over 500 gallons, and this gave the 52 a range of over 885 kilometers, linking distant European cities such as Stockholm and Berlin, or Copenhagen and Amsterdam, with non-stop luxury service. Tante Ju, or Auntie Junkers, as the German airman called her, could carry 17 passengers in plush comfort. Oil for the hungry BMW Radials was just as important, so each engine was equipped with an oil tank in the fairing above the wing. They were robust, rugged engines, and liberal quantities of oil inevitably leaked out. The resulting streaks and mist-like propeller spray often covered the aircraft's surfaces with a fine, slippery film, making it difficult for ground crews working on the plane. At the same time as Lufthansa was building its reputation for extraordinary service, Adolf Hitler was seeking to re-establish German self-esteem. Successes like Lufthansa became tools of propaganda, and the Junkers trimotor was held up as a marvel of German aviation. Proud workers presented a Teutonic image of efficiency. Feats like wing walking stood as proof positive that no risk was too great for the fatherland. In the days before electric starters, the Ju-52's engines were brought to life by a blast of compressed air from tanks inside the fuselage. At each stop, these were routinely topped up. Carrying passengers wasn't the only task. There was money to be made carrying air freight too. Cargo hatches provided access from underneath the fuselage for loading. But in the not-too-distant future, bombs would replace baggage as the cargo of choice. The 52 would first enter combat in Republican Spain during the Spanish Civil War. It was only the first of many nations to feel Tante U's deadly sting. But in the days before the rest of Europe erupted, aircraft like the Ju-52 were common tools of commerce. Tempelhof Airport was a showcase of commercial aviation. Its large terminal building and truly massive hangar block is still the world's third largest building. For 11 months in 1948, when the Soviets tried to cut off West Berlin from the free world, Tempelhof was the city's lifeline to the West. Over 2 million tons of supplies touched down on its worn runways. But that would come later. In the late 1930s, the streets of Berlin were caught up in a frenzy of arrogance and hate. And World War was just over the horizon. Starting the 3 BMW radials was a relatively simple thing, although some pilots said it was like playing a Wurlitzer organ. As the aircraft began to taxi, the pilots warmed the 3 engines and smoothed vibration by harmonizing RPM. The operation was complicated by a cantankerous air brake system that required constant monitoring. Eventually, Lufthansa's fleet grew to about 230 planes. Rudimentary ground control was achieved by flag and signal. Once the all clear was given, takeoff from the airport's massive grass field was directly into the wind. It was a ritual that would be repeated thousands of times over the coming years, as the 52's reputation made it the best-selling airliner in Europe. Even Professor Hugo Junkers, Tante U's father, couldn't have predicted just how successful his rugged airliner would become. Hugo Junkers, noted for his innovative approach to engineering, championed the development of the monoplane in the era of the biplane. Only months after Germany's defeat in World War I, Junkers unveiled the first truly modern commercial aircraft, the F-13. First flown in June of 1919, it went on to revolutionize air travel by making it safe, reliable, comfortable, and affordable. It marked the trail for the Ju-52 to follow. Junkers was the consummate pioneer. In 1910, when the automobile was still a novel idea, he acquired a patent on a flying wing aircraft. His immense G-38, flown some 20 years later, although a compromise, was his realization of that dream. With a massive wingspan of over 144 feet, its wing's depth of 5 feet 7 inches allowed passengers to be seated internally. Sections of the wing's leading edge were glazed to give passengers a wonderful forward view. Even the 4 engines could be observed during flight via passageways in the wings. The 2-deck fuselage allowed seating for 7 crew members and 34 passengers. 2 G-38s were built, and both met violent ends. One crashed in 1936, and the other was destroyed by RAF bombers in 1940. But by early 1930, Junkers completed plans for a large, single-engined, all-metal aircraft based on the pioneering F-13. One of these original single-engine Ju-52s was sold to Canadian Airways. Registered CF-ARM, it was shipped to Quebec, and by the end of November 1931 was carrying passengers and cargo throughout the northern provinces. Dubbed the Flying Goose, fur traders, mining companies, and construction teams hauled lumber, cattle, food, dynamite, horses, and almost anything else that could be squeezed into its spacious cabin. Junkers' use of aluminium alloy in construction was perfectly suited to the cold northern environment, so unforgiving to wood and fabric. When fitted with floats, this aircraft became the largest single-engine seaplane in the world. But that single-engine configuration turned out to be the 52's Achilles heel. During the 1930s, aircraft engine reliability was still a gamble, and the Ju-52 had absolutely no fallback if its one power plant went down. With that in mind, Junkers and the 52's original designer, Ernst Zindel, returned to the drawing board. In April of 1932, an improved Ju-52 took to the air. Now equipped with 3 engines and designated the Ju-52 3M, the stage was set for pioneering efforts across Europe that would make history. In its new robust form, the Tanta U quickly developed a reputation for reliability. As a result, it was the first to establish the lucrative route to Rome. The Alps, once considered an almost insuperable barrier, were now just a marvelous backdrop for the journey south. Seated comfortably, the 17 passengers enjoyed panoramic views through the main cabin's large windows. Though the aircraft wasn't pressurized, oxygen was available for use at high altitude and could be inhaled through a flexible tube. It was typical of Lufthansa's impeccable service that many flights offered in-flight radio telegrams sent by Morse code from the flight deck. The business traveler had a fold-away typewriter at his or her disposal, the laptop of a bygone age. And with a hint of times to come, a separate smoker's compartment was situated at the rear of the main cabin. Such comfort and service were without precedent and served as a blueprint that airlines today still follow. The Berlin to Rome route across the Alps took by 1930 standards an incredibly brief 10 hours. The Ju-52 was helping to conquer the tyranny of distance. In 1931, a joint venture between the Germans and the Chinese, Eurasia Aviation Corporation, was launched in China. Equipped with a variety of Junkers aircraft, the airline pioneered numerous routes that eventually spanned all of Asia. Ju-52s were introduced into the Eurasian fleet and made flights across the continent's vast, rugged landscape possible for the very first time. The airline brought modern transport to areas where for thousands of years the ox and the camel had been the primary mode of travel. Eventually, Eurasia was flying to exotic cities like Hong Kong and Hanoi and tracing the far-flung contours of the Great Wall. Juncker's aircraft blazed the trail for air routes in other parts of the world as well, including South America. In 1934, Lufthansa launched a mail route across the South Atlantic, destination Rio de Janeiro. Dornier flying boats, hopping between ingeniously positioned catapult ships anchored in mid-ocean, were used for the Atlantic crossing, and Ju-52s modified with floats proved ideal for the shorter delivery flights along the coast. These routes didn't just take mail delivery to seaports, but also to inland points in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. Once again, the Ju-52 was playing a role in making the world much smaller. In 1935, Hitler's Luftwaffe was born. Created in secrecy, it was the most modern and formidable instrument of area warfare yet devised. It also contradicted nearly everything Hugo Junkers believed in, and Junkers didn't hesitate to express his disapproval. In 1934, the Nazis forcefully removed him from his own enterprise, putting the huge company under their control. A year later, on his 76th birthday, the great aviation pioneer died. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Ju-52 was its metal skin. An accidental discovery in Germany in 1909 had resulted in duralumin, a durable aluminium alloy using copper and magnesium. It had aluminium's lightness, but was much stronger. As Junkers discovered, flat sheets of duralumin could be pressed into a corrugated form and then cut to shape and size with metal shears. The corrugations ran fore and aft and stiffened the structure. It provided a lightweight construction material of unparalleled strength. Duralumin was easy to repair and resistant to weather. Its one significant drawback: the corrugations created tremendous drag. The large horizontal tail and elevator had more area than the entire main wing of some aircraft. The Junkers double wing, a long flap and aileron that spanned the wing's full length, increased lift at low air speeds, and thereby improved performance and control during takeoff and landing. The Ju-52 appeared to leap from the ground. Little consideration was given to streamlining. Bits and pieces stuck out all over. So the drag was enormous, and the 52's engines had to fight it constantly. The most notable of the early three-engined aircraft was the famous Ford trimotor that first appeared in June of 1926. It was an American aircraft that played a key role in the development of U.S. air transport. Nicknamed the Tin Goose, Ford's aircraft was a true pioneer. This is the first non-stop flight from the United States mainland to Hawaii. With three engines, pilots had a measure of comfort during the long haul across the Pacific. In 1929, a Ford trimotor piloted by Admiral Richard Byrd had actually flown over the South Pole. Flying a Fokker F-7 trimotor, he'd already become the first to fly across the North Pole. But trimotors weren't just lumbering workhorses, as Italy's racy-looking Piaggio P-24 proved. First flown in 1938, it was a real record breaker, setting 2 world speed records while carrying a 5-ton payload. The P-24 was probably the sleekest-looking trimotor ever to take to the air. Though not nearly so beautiful, the Count Z506 trimotor seaplane was also a record-setter. Of all wood construction, it captured a number of world seaplane records. It saw service as a transport in the Mediterranean and the Adriatic. And in 1944, Mussolini made his escape in one of them. But perhaps the most famous Italian trimotor was the Savoia Marchetti SM-81 Pipistrello. It saw action as a bomber in 1935 in Ethiopia. It went on to fly in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II. In Germany, the Nazis were rapidly building up the Luftwaffe. The Ju-52's simple construction and operational versatility made it perfect for mass production. The Luftwaffe adopted the Ju-52 as an auxiliary bomber transport. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, the Nazis sent their Ju-52s to Morocco, carrying Moorish troops to aid Franco's flagging nationalist cause. A month later, the 52 underwent its baptism of fire while bombing the outskirts of Madrid. Later, a somewhat embarrassing situation arose when it transpired that at the same time Lufthansa was servicing Madrid with commercial Ju-52s. As a bomber, the Ju-52 was equipped with 2 vertical bomb bays carrying 3,300 pounds of bombs. The new dorsal and ventral gun positions were equipped with 7.9mm machine guns. The lower turret was mounted between the bomb bays and also served as the bombardier's aiming position. Because of its vulnerability, the Ju-52 proved short-lived as a bomber. As the strength of the Republican fighter force grew, more and more of the trimotors were relegated to night bombing and transport. Among the aircraft replacing the Ju-52 was another Junkers plane, the Ju-86. Designed in 1937 by Ernst Zindel, 5 Ju-86s were dispatched to Spain. Like its trimotored predecessor, the Ju-86 was equipped with a rotating lower gun turret that could be retracted and extended as needed. But the 86 soon fell prey to modernization, a new breed of bomber capable of high speeds, high altitudes, and far heavier bomb loads. Heinkel's HE-111 arrived as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Unveiled as a high-speed civil airliner, it was transformed into a bomber of unequaled speed and agility. The 52 continued to build its track record, proving itself indispensable in Spain. Hitler was later to comment, "Franco ought to erect a monument to the glory of the Ju-52. It's this aircraft that the Spanish Revolution has to thank for its victory." As Luftwaffe planes droned over Spain, across the Atlantic, another great transport was just finding its wings. Introduced in 1936, the Douglas DC-3 would become a legend in its own right. The plane heralded the birth of smooth-skinned, aerodynamically refined commercial aircraft and would form the backbone of the post-war airline industry throughout the world. Like the 52, it wasn't long before the threat of World War pressed the DC-3 into military service. Many were converted to troop and cargo transports. Called the C-47 by the military, the DC-3 became the Allies' sky train on every front. Nearly 11,000 were produced in the US alone, and untold additional numbers rolled off production lines around the globe. With numerous examples still flying today, the DC-3 is proof that good, simple, rugged design is timeless. By the opening months of World War II, Tantayu's distinctive shape was well known to the troops on the ground. The Nazis' blitzkrieg in Poland prevailed in part as a result of the many support missions flown by the plane. With highly mobile armor and tactical aircraft leading ground forces through and around Polish defenses, the need for rapid resupply was paramount to success. In the course of nearly 2,500 flights during the Polish campaign, the Ju-52s transported 1,600 tons of supplies and nearly 20,000 troops. It was a logistical effort of epic proportions. But the 52 was descended from a long line of rugged transport aircraft working some of the most unforgiving environments in the world. An earlier Junkers trimotor transport, the G-31, had proved indispensable in Papua New Guinea throughout the 1930s. 3, owned by the Bololo Gold Dredging Company, hauled supplies from the coast across steaming jungles and treacherous mountains to the gold fields. Equipped with a large roof hatch in addition to the standard side doors, they could be loaded directly by crane. Among the cargoes were oil, spare parts, cattle, horses, vehicles, and anything else to keep the gold flowing. At the time, these 3 planes were said to have carried more freight than all the world's air transport fleets put together. Remarkably, this massive gold mine, every piece of equipment, all the fuel, every nut and bolt, the makings of a whole township, were hauled in totally by air. As the war spread throughout Europe, the 52 began to take on a variety of responsibilities. The Ju-52 would not only ferry fresh troops and supplies to Germany's multiple fronts, but also act as an air ambulance, flying mercy runs for the wounded. But its most dynamic role as a frontline aircraft came when it was assigned to carry paratroopers of the Luftwaffe's newly formed elite airborne force into combat. In this new mission, Old Iron Annie, as the 52 was affectionately called then, found itself in the thick of battle. With the war escalating, Hitler, spurred on by his easy conquest of Poland, wanted to test his airborne forces' ability to capture and control key areas. Airborne drops were one of the Führer's pet projects, and when the opportunity to use them in Norway occurred, he didn't hesitate. Securing airports, bridges, and other strategic targets, the paratroopers cleared the way and gave the Luftwaffe secure bases from which to operate. Success in Norway led to further airborne operations across Holland, France, and Belgium. As fortifications fell and important bridges were secured across Western Europe, the path was laid open for German armor. Panzers began rolling across country after country. These attacks, made possible by the Ju-52s, would finally result in the subjugation of millions. Commander of the Luftwaffe's airborne forces was General Kurt Student. His brilliant tactics opened the way for penetration into the Low Countries. But his men, though lauded by Hitler, were not the first. They'd learned much from observing Russia's use of paratroops during the Red Army's 1939 winter offensive against Finland. During that struggle, parachute-equipped combat troops were born into action by converted Tupolev AN-T-6 bombers. Student took these lessons to heart. It was the conception of a new kind of war, a war of air mobility. Dropping men by parachute was not the only way to get them into combat. Troop-carrying gliders, towed over their targets by Ju-52s, were also successful. The gliders were perfect for quick and silent surprise attacks, and were instrumental in some of the most celebrated German victories early in the war. The war spread across Europe and into North Africa. The harsh conditions of the Desert Campaign tested both man and machine. Here, too, the Ju-52 played its part, hauling supplies deep into the wasteland to keep Rommel's mighty Afrika Korps rolling. Huge armadas droned across the Mediterranean to North Africa. But even with their fighter escorts, the vulnerable 52s went down by the hundreds. As part of the German strategy to take control of the Mediterranean, the conquest of the island of Crete was considered imperative. But the British, firmly entrenched on the island, had no intention of letting it go. So began the largest airborne invasion in history. Orchestrated by Student, it called for the landing of 30,000 paratroops and the destruction of all British forces there. Of May 20th, 1941, the first of hundreds of Ju-52s darkened the skies. Each aircraft, departing from either Italy or Greece, carried 18 fully equipped paratroops. Crete would provide an important strategic base for the air war against the British in the eastern Mediterranean. Crete held 28,000 British, Australian and New Zealand troops, and the Luftwaffe tactics would be to overwhelm. 500 Ju-52s and 3 glider towing groups planted thousands of troops on the ground. Bombers made massive airstrikes, and fleets of fighters provided cover for the bombers and for the heavily laden transports. With dogmatic perseverance, the Nazis achieved victory, but not without great cost. Over 7,000 men, 1 out of every 4 paratroopers filling the skies over Crete, were killed or wounded. Afterwards, Hitler bitterly decreed that he would never again use airborne troops on such a large scale. And the next massive airdrop of paratroopers would be an Allied one, behind the beaches of Normandy in 1944. The square, boxy fuselage of the Ju-52 was cavernous. The plane's horizontally split cargo door was eminently practical, and the lower door could be used as a loading platform. The extraordinarily harsh conditions on the Eastern Front put German logistics to the acid test. Long supply routes became impassable seas of mud, and the retreating Russians left only scorched earth behind. For the Wehrmacht, deliverance would have to come from the air. Vast frozen tundra and winter's icy blizzards had been Russia's impregnable fortress for centuries. Like Napoleon's armies before them, the Germans struggled and died. While Nazi commanders waited and watched, Luftwaffe transports, mainly Ju-52s, performed the massive task at front. When the German Sixth Army under General von Paulus thrust toward Stalingrad, one of the most horrifying chapters in the history of World War II began. Men fought in hideous conditions, fighting and freezing to death in temperatures 30 below zero. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, and before it was over, more than 1 million soldiers and civilians were dead. When von Paulus's Sixth Army became trapped in the city, Hitler boasted that nobody will ever drive us out of Stalingrad. Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, promised to fly in supplies. The Soviet commander at Stalingrad flies a day, less than 1/5 of the minimum needed. Soon, German soldiers weren't only 200. Many attempts were made to develop a replacement for the 52, but none was successful. One was the Arado 232, a plane designed to land on the most primitive airstrips. The millipede sported a bizarre collection of idler wheels mounted along the aircraft's center line. The aircraft was lowered onto them during the loading and unloading process. They enabled the 232 to taxi on soft or uneven ground. The plane had a large rear ramp and enough cabin space for 2 Kubelwagens, the German Jeep. It saw only limited use before the war's end. Auntie Junkers had offshoots of her own. The Ju-252 was an attempt to upgrade the plane by combining the best physical qualities of the 52 with improved performance. Gone were the drag-creating corrugated metal and fixed landing gear. The fourth prototype 252 had 3 1,400 horsepower Junkers Jumo engines and a large rear loading ramp. The 252 never entered mass production. Old Iron Annie would outlive them all. She's still flying today. This particular Ju-52 is privately owned by a British company, Aces High. It's not an original Ju-52. It was built in Spain after the war and known as the Casa 352. 170 were built and widely used by the Spanish Air Force. This aircraft was painstakingly restored to wartime condition and painted in authentic Luftwaffe colors. Now something of a celebrity, it has appeared in epic movies like The Battle of Britain and the Indiana Jones adventures. This Spanish-built 52, built in 1954 and used as a military transport, eventually wound up in the hands of a private collector in Britain. Then, in 1981, it was sold to South African Airlines. It was flown across the English Channel to Bremen, where it was dismantled, crated up, and shipped to South Africa. There, historians and engineers thoroughly restored the aircraft, which they named after the first South African airline 52, Jan van Riebeck. Lufthansa too has restored its Ju-52 to pristine 1930s condition. Here the beautiful Tempelhof shares the sky with Lufthansa's most recent acquisition, a new Boeing 737. 2 generations, separated by much history and many technological advances, flying side by side. One will soon travel routes carved out decades ago by the other. The 52, embodying a past of pioneer triumphs and tragic glory, strains to fly as fast as it can. The Boeing, in all its glistening potential, strains to stay aloft at the pace of a bygone era.